back to the International Climate Webinar Series interviews. Our guest today is a proven pioneer in digital markets and the leader driving the FinTech technology toward net zero. He has nearly 3 decades of expertise in electronic trading, having successfully co-founded Europe's largest exchanges, Europe. Today, he is the chairman and CEO of GMEX Group and the climate fintech platform as a service Zero13, which was recognized at COP28 for its innovative use of blockchain to scale climate finance and named the world best exchange for ESG 20 regular speaker at high-profile global forums from Davos. He is the intersection of a cutting-edge digital transformation. Please welcome with me Hirander, Misra. What's the most valuable non-technical lesson learned building GMEX that you know in Zero13?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting because when you create a trading venue or an exchange or any kind of platform that attracts liquidity, the key is liquidity itself, but also connectivity and distribution, because ultimately you have to make it easy for buyers and sellers. And there also needs to be a regulatory driver and an economic driver for these things to work, which is no different. When we did this in GMEX, you had the MiFID regulations in Europe. But when we then look to net zero, you've got Article 6 and aspects of that with Article 6.2 and 6.4 around carbon credits. And there's a broader opportunity around water, energy, and food security.
What is the biggest constant you think that decade in climate fintech?
Technology and more technology as an enabler. We're at an exciting time in a climate sense because there's a convergence of technologies that are really, really useful in that drive to net zero. You know, we have blockchain and certainly a lot of the work is done to address greenwashing and double counting with some of the things that we do and tokenizing assets. But at the same time, you have Internet of Things, you have AI and quantum computing. A lot's been made of the carbon footprint of some of these technologies, but there can certainly be decarbonization and carbon. The technological age we're in is going to encourage source to sale provenance, trust, and integrity, which is going to increase liquidity in carbon markets and also accelerate the drive to net zero.
We see that you are a very, very active expert traveling. What is your one essential sharp for this high-profile event?
Yeah, I mean, some people often ask me, why don't I suffer from jet lag? Because, you know, you're often in different parts of the world. And the key to acclimatize is whatever time zone you're in, don't sleep until it's time to sleep. You know, you land somewhere early in the morning and you fall asleep, and then it creates kind of a different time zone and really not harmony at all. So I think the key is, I mean, I learned from flight attendants and some of the tricks, but equally, you know, you hit the ground running and you let the adrenaline carry you. I mean, Davos, the World Economic Forum there, COP30 and other events coming up, very intense. So you let the adrenaline kind of carry you, and sometimes sleep is optional, but you know, at the end of the week, it's quite fruitful.
How of green real world assets changing the liquidity accessibility?
There is a multi-trillion-dollar annual financing gap. You know, the World Economic Forum puts that at about $4 trillion a year. In reality, it's much, much more. Traditional finance isn't necessarily solving that gap to the extent that it should. And so there's a real opportunity here for accelerated finance from the digital side, because there's big demand on the digital side from cryptocurrencies into mainstream for real world assets. Those real world assets, from energy resources, land resources, whether it's forestry and land restoration, to carbon credit sets on the other side of the spectrum and associated with that. And in reality, even mine tailings restoration and everything that comes with that. So I think the beauty here is you're starting to make sustainability economic rather than a cost in its own right. That's also driving kind of sustainable economics and green industrialization, like a lot of the work we do in Africa. And that's actually encouraging a more accelerated move to net zero based on the financing and also the actions as well.
You mentioned carbon markets and going there, what is the most underrated fintech innovation you see and can really improve the transparency of carbon markets?
An excellent question. There are too many vertical silos. Everyone wants to build their own empires, or they think, this is mine, that's yours. The real driver on this is interoperability and interconnectivity, because ultimately we have to break down those silos. Everyone speaks, for example, about blockchain being one ubiquitous technology, but there are many blockchains, both public and private. Equally, traditional finance and application programming interfaces aren't going away anytime soon. So the old world and the new world have to coexist. And the real opportunity there is to bridge those worlds and make it easier to issue assets with underlying provenance, such as carbon credits or other green assets, to make them investable, to then trade them, and then to sell them effectively. And those orchestration technologies, and we're doing that at Zero13, and there are other networks, and we like to take a network of networks approach. These are key now to really propagate scale in these markets.
Thank you. Talking about investment, how can digital infrastructure help directly these developing markets?
I was in Kenya the day that USAID disbanded, and people don't realize, they just think, aid will go into local community projects and small scale things, but it impacted everything from their national healthcare to those community driven initiatives and projects. And, there was one country I was engaged with in Africa, not to mention the name, but the dearth of USAID caused a $1.2 billion financing gap a year for them. In many ways, that's a blessing and a curse. A curse in that money is no longer there. But what it's encouraging these countries to do is really look at the natural resources and the expertise that they have, and look at how they can harness that and no longer rely on charity, but rely on economic development, leveraging assets in a fair and equitable manner. This presents a great opportunity, not only for the global South, but also for the global North, because the global North, and in that I'd put the GCC countries as well, not just the Western countries, we're all worried about water, energy, and food security. And post-COVID, that's been ever more a problem that's been exacerbated. Now, that equitable balance allows both the global South and the global North to develop effectively in a fair and equitable fashion. And you're not killing the goose that lays the golden egg, meaning if the global South create that output, global North benefits from it too.
Thank you. In addition, you have spoken at Connected Africa, where Zero13 is active. How can real-world assets focused FinTech help to bridge this gap? And maybe what's policy you see change by COP30 in Brazil?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting because, COP29 in Belém, Article 6 was finally agreed after nearly a decade, which meant an effective route that was better governed for carbon markets. Now, we got ahead of that 1 year before, and then at COP made the announcement of operationalizing Ghana's activity under Article 6 into Singapore, for example. Now, if we look at it, what I don't necessarily like at COPs is these climate pledges in terms of finance are made, and either they're under the much needed amounts annually, or alternatively, some of those pledges never materialize. So I think now taking a model that's equity focused, harnessing both capital from the digital side as well as the traditional side, this is going to lead to an acceleration. So, I'd like to see more adoption of tokenization across some of these organizations. The World Bank and others have looked at it in the past, but not necessarily adopted it. But if you look at UNFCCC, UNDP, even what they do in terms of registries and what they do in terms of some of the methodologies lend themselves well to use of AI, use of blockchain. But that's also going to create more trust and accelerate the adoption of climate finance. So I think really, the World Economic Forum last time, all the talk was about technology and climate. And it was really interesting. Recently I took my daughter before she started university to some of the open days. And in the environmental science climate finance lecture at King's, the first thing they spoke about was digital. And therefore, whether it's working with the telecommunication firms, whether it's working with the cloud providers, up the stack at the transaction level, all of this is key to drive this forward.
Thank you. Now, can we find the right balance point for regular oversight in digital assets?
There's no such thing as harmonized digital asset regulations, because if you look, UK's got its own regime, Europe under MiCA has its own, and now the good news is the Genius Act in the US will allow increasingly those assets to go mainstream. And of course, in the UAE, the FSRA under Abu Dhabi Global Market have been very active for some time in that sphere. So I think there's never going to be such a thing as harmonized regulations that are exactly the same. It's no different if you look at banking regulations, but what you do start to see is common standards being adopted, common methodologies and common protocols. And I think increasingly we're beginning to see that on the digital asset side, whereas for many a year, the digital asset side and the traditional side didn't mix. And one was deemed to be the Wild West on the digital side, and then the traditional side was wary of it. Now we're seeing increasing adoption from firms like BlackRock to JP Morgan on the one hand, to other sort of fast emerging players, also reducing the barriers to entry, which is then encouraging adoption, which all in all then means there's more tools available to us on the climate side, whether it's climate finance, carbon markets, or wider green asset than there have been ever before. And some of that best practice is being captured under some common standards because we're involved in some of those. For example, connectivity is fostered to send driven order using something called fixed protocol. They're increasingly looking at how that can be used for carbon markets, for example.
What specific climate fintech challenge will be solved in?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because, at the moment, we seem to be joining up different levels of the ecosystem or its manual. You're increasingly going to see agents as a service that are AI driven drive a lot of this activity. So, for example, one example being project development description takes a long time to create. Project to project, let's say on agroforestry land restoration, there might be a 5% difference and then commonality, 95%. Now, that will be created very, very quickly, which will also lower the time taken to issuance. There's much lower costs to be able to register carbon credits and other. They're much more fungible. So we're going to see all of this accelerate. And ultimately, it's something we call alignment of the 7 Cs. So climate has to be aligned with carbon. It has to be aligned with connectivity. It has to be aligned with capital. But also then that has to benefit communities, companies, and countries as well.